Every time I grow a new beard, there are more white hairs in it. You tell me if it is a blessing or a curse that the video quality on this camera is not high enough so you in the audience cannot see just how many white hairs are in this beard right now. The concept of a global minimum wage is something so obvious, so simple, and so fundamental that would be supported by people on the far left, conservatives, and even people on the far right. Not only out of some kind of idealistic desire to make the world a better place, but in fact out of brutal self-interest. It's an idea whose time has not yet come, but I think it's coming soon. I think we can see the need to articulate this goal of a global minimum wage in the incoherent responses to the breakdown of the neoliberal paradigm that are reflected equally in Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. Both Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump are populists with an anti-neoliberal agenda. Both Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump vaguely say that they're going to make America great again. If you don't believe me, I mean, Bernie Sanders' book, the 2016 book, Our Revolution, he's promising he's going to make Detroit great again. And this is getting at the same kind of mythology. The lost days of yore when heavy manufacturing industry, the car industry in Detroit was booming. That's what Bernie Sanders is promising he's going to bring America back to. That's the greatness Bernie Sanders wants to revive. Okay. Both Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump have a somewhat incoherent discourse about making America great again. And they both articulate this in tandem with a rhetoric blaming China and blaming Mexico for the deindustrialization of America, the unmaking of America's former greatness. Now, I'm not even saying they're wrong. What I'm saying is they present this rhetoric, which is merely the politics of complaining about a problem. And what remains left unsaid is the promise of any possible solution, right? So, United States, NAFTA, okay, Donald Trump came into power saying that NAFTA was a terrible agreement and he never supported it. Even right now in 2019, Bernie Sanders is running for office. He's running for president of the United States, repeatedly saying NAFTA was a terrible trade agreement and he never supported it. Really, I'm not kidding you. NAFTA, the bone of contention here is free trade between the United States and Mexico, leading to Mexicans manufacturing everything Americans use, not just cars, but including cars and car parts. Okay, both Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump reject the neoliberal paradigm, and they reject Bill Clinton's decision to grant China permanent normal trade relations, PNTR. PNTR was created just so that America could stop using the term most favored nation status. There was a time when most favored nation status was only extended to countries the United States actually viewed favorably. And as they were starting to extend this special trade status to despised and enemy nations like communist China, someone had to come up with a confusing new acronym. Anyway, during the Bill Clinton presidency, there were negotiations and a settlement, and fatefully, those decisions made during the Bill Clinton era utterly transformed both the United States and China, transformed Europe too, transformed most of the world, and resulted in the situation we have right now. Most of the computer equipment I'm using to record this YouTube video is made in China or partly made in China. And it's very likely that the computer and the computer screen and the other equipment you're seeing this through, it's very likely that it's made in China or that it's at least partly made in China. So this transformed the world in various ways. Okay, so here we are in the year 2019, 2020 elections are coming up. We have a somewhat incoherent, post-neoliberal, anti-neoliberal political discourse emerging, both on the left and on the right. What are they going to do? How are they going to achieve this? Well, you might or might not have noticed that when Donald Trump was renegotiating the trade agreement with Mexico, one element of it proposed or achieved was to force Mexico to pay the laborers in the automotive industry more, to pay a higher wage to the people making cars and car parts in Mexico. Now, honestly, I don't know how that story ends. And there, in principle, you already have the first step towards a global minimum wage, and you have a hint at why it would be in the interests of the wealthy and not just the poor to bring about this change. Okay? If any of you are old enough to remember, there was a time when the United States of America responded to the unwanted competition of Japanese car manufacturers, Mitsubishi, Toyota, so on and so forth, with panic. And it's very strange because the discourse I remember, believe me, I've read formal articles about this, I've read book chapters about it, and part of my university education, not just part of my childhood experience. It seemed like every possible explanation for the Japanese superiority in manufacturing cars was invoked, except the inequality in wages, right? It's like, of course the exchange rates were blamed, like the exchange rate between Japanese yen and the US dollar. There were a lot of vague ideas that somehow the Japanese were tougher or meaner than Americans, that, Detroit was some kind of decadent place where unionization or moral lassitude had resulted in the automotive industry falling behind, and that the Japanese somehow just had a superior level of technology or level of social organization, or were harder working, or they just wanted it more.
Well, you got to hand it to those dolphins. They just wanted it more.
The American spirit was held up to the Japanese spirit, and Americans asked themselves briefly, why is it that, Detroit can't compete with Toyota?
You're looking at a 78 Toyota Corolla donated by Hoot McInerney in Oak Park. We've got Tim Donovan here taking his frustrations out on this 78 Toyota. This is all in good fun.
Why is it that they produce cars more cheap than us? And of course, a really important part of the answer is because wages were lower in Japan, because the minimum wage was very low in Japan, because the actual amount being paid to automotive workers was lower in Japan. And this hinted at what would really destroy the American automotive industry, which wasn't Japan, it was Mexico, and now, just lately, even China. If the wealthier countries say to the poorer countries, we will not let you export these manufactured items to us unless you pay your workers a fair wage. This doesn't just benefit the poor and the downtrodden of the world. It benefits industry within those wealthier countries. It benefits the working class everywhere. It raises standards of living. And it also creates an incentive for third world countries to adopt higher levels of technology, higher levels of organization, and so on, to not rely on just mass employment at the lowest possible level of manual labor, right? Now, that's also in the interest of Western countries, because if poor countries are going to increase their level of technology for manufacturing, it's most likely they're going to do it by buying or importing the technology from countries that are already Western. So it's going to result in poor countries moving up the value chain more rapidly, and it would also result in places like Detroit being capable of producing cars at a competitive rate. Now, if you say that's completely impossible, yeah, you have a point. Maybe your perspective is that manufacturing cars is only possible in countries that have a very, very low minimum wage. What country has the highest minimum wages in the world? Of course, that's going to have to be adjusting for cost of living, adjusting for exchange rates. You're going to have to make a lot of adjustments. Long story short, what country has the highest minimum wage in the world? It's Australia. And guess what? Australia actually does have a car manufacturing industry. They actually do make and export some cars. Australia is actually a really interesting case study if you want to see what happens, the good and the bad of it, when you have higher minimum wages. Nobody right now is really asking what the knock-on effects would be of Bernie Sanders' increase to the American minimum wage if it's carried out in isolation. Nobody wants to really think through the impact on Louisiana, on second-string cities throughout the United States, on rural areas, if suddenly there's a $15 minimum wage in the poorer parts within the United States, as well as a $15 minimum wage in big cities like Seattle and Los Angeles. There are some really, really serious dislocations, some really serious disadvantages that are going to ensue that are worth thinking through. Now, by the way, I do support increasing the minimum wage in the United States. I'm just warning, there is no such thing as a free lunch in economics. There's no policy that's 100% advantageous and 0% disadvantageous. But the other thing that's going to happen, if you think about it internationally, increasing the minimum wage in America is also increasing the gap that separates the cost of manufacturing in America from the cost of manufacturing in Mexico, or the cost of manufacturing in China, or any other poor country where things now are manufactured. So precisely the evil that Bernie Sanders is ranting against endlessly. I've both read his book and I've listened to a lot of his lectures now. Bernie Sanders is always talking about the evils of neoliberalism and jobs moving overseas. Well, guess what, Bernie? If you get your dream and you pass a $15 an hour minimum wage in the United States, you will accelerate and exacerbate the fleeing of manufacturing jobs out of the United States to countries that have lower wages, including Mexico right next door. Now, what would be the way to counteract that? Donald Trump has had some really vague and self-contradictory rhetoric about that, about what he allegedly will do to just kind of bully companies into staying in the United States. Bernie Sanders also has some very incoherent rhetoric, which he's basically just blaming and angry at companies for moving jobs offshore. I think he suggests changes to the tax code or something to disincentivize these things. Point number 3 on screen here is an example of how incoherent Bernie Sanders' promises are on this issue. He means well, but what would actually happen if he followed this plan is that Americans would continue to import cheaply manufactured goods from Mexico. They'd continue to import cheaply manufactured goods from China. Both of those countries would continue to pay their workers low wages. The cost of American wages would go up because Bernie Sanders has his $15 an hour minimum wage. He would punish American companies that move jobs offshore, but he's not going to punish American companies that simply import manufactured goods from China and Mexico. And also, what if it's a French company that owns a factory in Vietnam? What if it's a Canadian company that owns a factory in China? What if it's a German company that owns a factory in Mexico? All of those will continue exporting to the United States. So all it's doing is excluding American companies uniquely from participating in this part of neoliberal competition. This would be a disaster. It works as rhetoric to get yourself elected, but you do not need a degree in economics to see that this is deeply incoherent. The thing you can do is you can say to Mexico, look, if you want to be able to export your goods here to the United States of America, you have to pay your workers $12 an hour, something like this, which for Mexico might be a huge increase. And you could say the same to Japan, and you could say the same to China, and you could say the same to Vietnam and Malaysia, to all these different countries you're trading partners with. You could say, look, if you are not paying your workers a decent salary, why should we accept manufactured goods from your country? And in a sense, you can make this sting a little more by saying that you will accept raw materials, but you'll create this incentive to say, look, if what you want to send us are finished products or manufactured goods, then you have to meet our standards for what is a decent wage, what is a decent minimum wage for your workers. It's not a right to export goods into the United States. It's a privilege, and we're only going to grant those privileges to countries that treat their workers decently. It's really extending the same principle whereby many countries in the past refused to trade with or accept goods from countries that had slavery. It's just that instead of it being slavery you're objecting to, it's people being paid $2 an hour or $5 an hour instead of $12 an hour. But the other thing is, it's ultimately, transparently, completely self-serving. It's the ultimate form of protectionism, because it's also saying, hey, look, if you want to manufacture cars, that's great. You can manufacture cars and you can export them to the United States, you can export them to Europe. But if we're going to compete to see who really makes the best car, then all of us are going to pay our workers $12 an hour, $15 an hour, whatever it is. We all have to pay our workers the same minimum wage, because otherwise we're not really competing for who makes a better car. We're just competing for who can pay their workers less. Global minimum wage is a policy that would be supported by the left. It would be supported by conservatives on the right. It would be supported by the vast majority of everyone because it's in everyone's interest, and it actually avoids the social dislocations and disadvantages to just having a minimum wage within one country, which is what Bernie Sanders is right now proposing. However, at this moment, it's a political idea that is being propounded and supported by absolutely no one. And the best thing of all is, this can be implemented with absolutely no violence, with no need even for a United Nations resolution or international governing body to oversee it. It can be implemented country by country just by signing agreements, trade pacts, where you say, look, if you want to export to our country, this is the standard you need to meet.
Dun, 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 dun.